Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for being with us tonight. Um, this is the District 5 Town Halls. We've gone back to virtual for a time being with the COVID numbers being still high, but starting to go back down again. And so tonight we're going to be discussing the recently adopted non-discrimination ordinance that we have here in Athens-Clarke County, and really trying to get into how it works, um, which I think it's a bit complicated. So I want to try to be able to pull back some of those complications and make it understandable for folks who just to know how it works, but also if anybody was facing discrimination, how they can go ahead and file a complaint if they are experiencing that discrimination. Um, Tonight we have with us, I'll just go across the screen here, Assistant County Attorney Sherry Hines, who's with us. Thank you so much, Sherry. Assistant County Manager Nikki Jones. Thank you for being with us, Nikki. Really appreciate it. And the Director of the ACC Office of Inclusion with us, Crystal Coburn. I appreciate you being with us too, Crystal. And we're streaming this on our usual way of doing the virtual ones on platforms and recording it. But we do have some constituents who will be signing on who might have questions to be able to ask and to engage with us throughout this. But I also have some questions that were sent in and also some questions just for myself to try to offer some clarity here as we talk about this process. So with all that being said, I'll just go ahead and jump into this and we'll get into some of the questions. And Sherry, Nikki, and Crystal, please feel free to jump in and offer any insights or information as we go through this. I'll kind of throw the questions out there to all three of y'all, and we can just have some dialogue about it. The first thing I think we should get into is when we have a non-discrimination ordinance is what do we mean by discrimination, and what forms of discrimination is this non-discrimination ordinance going to be able to protect people against, because it doesn't cover everything in it. It has to have some limitations to it. Jerry, I might open this up to you first, just to speak to what specific forms of discrimination this ordinance actually relates to.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we can get some good questions answered for everyone today. But I think the easiest thing to point to, and I'm happy to share my screen at some point if that would be helpful, but the unlawful discrimination statute itself speaks to the different categories. And what we're talking about here are what we would refer to as protected classes in the law. But you can always go back and refer to this purpose and intent section or ordinance if you ever have any questions about the types of things that we're looking at. So what it says is discrimination based on actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, ancestry, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, disability, marital status, familial status, or veteran/military status. So as you can imagine, that is a really, really broad set of characteristics that this ordinance is designed to protect. So as Commissioner Denson said, it does not quite cover every possible avenue of discrimination that one might imagine, but it certainly covers all of the current protected classes that are recognized by law. So certainly if you felt that you were discriminated at work because of your race, or because of your gender, or because you have a child, those are things that you could certainly raise under this ordinance. If you felt that you were denied housing, for instance, because you have children, that would be something that you could raise. And probably what's most helpful to say next is, if you were to look at section 6-21-3, which says civil rights declared, those 5 subsections talk about the specific types of, rights that this ordinance is designed to protect against, or to protect, period. So those are basically employment, public accommodations and services that you might receive. So the ability to rent a hotel room, or the ability to be served at a restaurant, housing, as we've already talked about, And then most importantly, the ability to exercise those rights without being retaliated against. So to be able to say to your employer that they need to treat you fairly, regardless of what protected class you may be a member of, that they can't then fire you because you've raised that concern. So I hope that at least gives kind of a broad spectrum of the possible types of acts and the classes that are protected by this ordinance.
That does. That does. Thank you, Sharon. Like there is a lot there, but again, not everything. So, and going into, I think the broadest thing that you talked about there, and my understanding is that public accommodations definition, which can be kind of broad, but still, again, has those limitations. Could you speak at all about how it like private clubs, and there are some exemptions from what that public accommodations means there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some specific exemptions that are written into, I think, sections 6-21-4, excuse me. And so it does include religious organizations, which are one of the largest exemptions. But like you mentioned, there's also bona fide nonprofit private clubs. They are specifically exempted for better or worse. And so there are a whole lot of rules about what makes an organization a true bona fide non-private club. But typically what we're talking about there are going to be country clubs, things like that. The idea is that a bona fide nonprofit private club has to be exclusive. Not anybody can join. You have to have members. They usually have to pay for those benefits. So to the extent that you think that you might have been discriminated against by such a private club, what I would say to you is it does not hurt you in any way, shape, or form, other than to the extent that you are creating a public record if you file a complaint. I think that is important to share with you that, you know, even though we would love to keep everything that you might provide to us confidential, when you submit a complaint, it is a public record and it's releasable under the Georgia Open Records Act. But other than that, to the extent that that may or may not be harmful to you, there is no penalty, no reason that I can see that you wouldn't want to necessarily just file a complaint with us and then let us explore that and try to determine if the entity that you believe is discriminated against you could qualify or might not qualify as a nonprofit private club. Did that help answer your question?
Definitely. I think so. And and some of that's going to be, you know, like you said, if there's uncertainty, it's best for the person to go ahead and try to apply, and then they can be seen if it's applicable or not. But I have one more question, just kind of getting into the meat of what this protects and who it protects and how. So my understanding of this, as we worked on this, is that it applies not just to Athens residents, but also any individuals who might be visiting here or working here or going to school here. Is that correct?
Sorry, I was muted. But yes, it does, absolutely. So just in the same way that our local laws apply to anybody who is here. So, you know, someone who's in town for a Georgia game could be arrested or charged under a public intoxication ordinance, for example. Hopefully not, but it could happen, right? The same thing applies for this ordinance. So if you believe that you've been discriminated within Athens-Clarke County by a business here, you know, by a citizen, you know, really all that matters is that the discrimination happened in Athens-Clarke County. So to make that clear, the fact that you live here, if you were discriminated, say, in Commerce, Georgia, or someplace outside of the county, you wouldn't be able to file something here in Athens-Clarke County just because you're a resident. It has to have occurred within Athens-Clarke County.
Okay, yes, I think that's a great way to clarify this. Yeah, as long as the act of discrimination happened here in Athens-Clarke County. Well, fantastic. I think we got kind of through what it covers and who it covers and where. I'll open this up to everyone. So Nikki or Crystal, if you have ways to clarify this too, please jump in. So if someone was to be discriminated against, no matter where they're from here in Athens-Clarke County, what is the process of them filing that complaint? How exactly does a person go about filing it?
And that's probably easiest for me to answer as well. So if I can share my screen, I'll see if it'll let me. I think that would be the easiest thing to do. I think this is the right screen. No, maybe not. I apologize. Sorry. I'm just going to share my entire screen. That is much easier if I do that. All right. Okay, so I know not a lot of people spend a lot of time on the attorney's office webpage with the county, but it does exist. And if you just Google attorney's office in Athens, you'll either get our page or the district attorney's page. So you want to make sure you go to just the attorney's office. And when you scroll down, there are these links to documents. And so the first document you'll see is the Unlawful Discrimination Ordinance itself. So that's a great resource for you to go learn more about this, or, if you'd like. But then below it, there is the complaint form itself. And that's provided to you in both a PDF and in a Word format. Unfortunately, you do have to print it off because we do require that these forms be notarized. That said, we're not trying to create barriers. It's just basically so that we can make sure that the person who is providing it to us is the person who is the actual complainant, and that we can have some level of certainty about that. So we do, except for this week, we always have someone here at the office who's able to notarize. So a really easy thing for you to do is to either print this form out, fill it out in advance at your leisure, and then come to our office before you sign it, and then you can sign it in front of our notary for free, and we'll be happy to take it that way. And certainly if you don't have access to this, you just want to come to our office physically, we'll be happy to print it off for you and help you fill it out. That's not a problem. Our office is in the Board of Election, or it's in the building that most people think of as the Board of Elections building. It's actually called Civic Hall. It is right behind City Hall, and our physical address is 155 East Washington Street, which you can see here. But when you go to that, you're going to see the Board of Elections right on Washington Street. And so if you take the steps that are to the right of that building, then you'll see our entrance is at the top of the building. But the good news in terms of filling this out is that, once you, and we can look at it really quickly, the form is actually pretty simple. And we looked at a couple different examples. I think it's Brookhaven's here that I printed off. I mean, it's a book. It's like a job application. And so not that isn't helpful, because all of the information in this is really valuable information, but we decided that might be really difficult for someone who just wants to go ahead and file a complaint. So we kept this very simple. And actually this is based on our original discrimination complaint form that was based solely on the older ordinance that some of you all may be familiar with, related to downtown dress code violations. And so we've actually, to make everything simpler, we've combine this form so it can work for either one. Basically, if you think you've been discriminated in any way, shape, or form, you can fill this out, give us what information you have, particularly any information you might have about the alleged violator. And you may not know much. You may say it was a bouncer at a bar, or it could be my employer, where you might know a lot more about them. But you'll provide us with whatever information you have, any witnesses that you may have. Again, not required that you provide us with witnesses, but it is really helpful if you know anyone. And then you'll sign that and we'll notarize it for you, or you can have it notarized someplace else. The good news is that even though the ordinance is fairly long and can be a little intimidating, the process for anybody who's watching who thinks that they may have been discriminated against is designed to be easy. In the sense that all we need is for you to fill out this form, and then we basically will take it from there. And so we'll then work with you to get some of that information that's in this much larger Brookhaven application to try to get more details. But this is at least the start of the process. And then we'll work with you moving forward as to how things play out.
Thank you. That is very helpful. And I think it shows that this is trying to make this as accessible as possible for somebody to be able to engage with. Did have a question submitted online about that, and the question is, what if the discrimination happened before the ordinance? Also, what is the window of time a person has to file the complaint?
Yep, fantastic question. So if the discrimination happened before this ordinance was passed, then generally we're not going to be able to do anything with this particular ordinance. Now, if it was a downtown dress code violation, in the sense that you're alleging that a bar was discriminatory, that because that ordinance already existed, you certainly can fill out the complaint form. The only other thing that we could do if it occurred before this ordinance was passed was try to connect you to other agencies. For instance, the EEOC primarily deals with employment discrimination, and they are a fantastic resource, and we could certainly direct you there to file a complaint. And then HUD has a lot of resources with regards to housing. And certainly you could contact a lawyer who may be able to pursue other avenues, but this ordinance is not available unless the event occurred after the ordinance was passed.
Okay. And is there a time limit of when you have to file the complaint by?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I forgot that part of the question.
Okay.
Yes, it is 90 days for this ordinance, and that's 90 calendar days, not 90 business days.
Okay. Always good to have that clarification. Yeah. Okay, great, fantastic. I think that this is really helpful. It's helping me organize my thoughts about how the process works too. My last kind of like procedural question on how this all works is, after that complaint is filed, can you talk about what the process is as we go through, who hears it and kind of how that works?
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing that's going to happen is that my office is going to review that, whether that's me or a different attorney in the office, and we're going to start to try to identify questions we may have, more information we may need to help us try to make a determination as to whether, one, that there's evidence that discrimination occurred, and secondly, whether it appears that that discrimination is applicable to this particular statute, or to this ordinance, excuse me. After that initial evaluation, there's a couple of things that can happen. This could be that we would reach out to the complainant and to the alleged violator to try to have some sort of non-binding mediation, some sort of dialogue to see if we could reach a resolution without moving to a more formal proceeding. It could also be that the facts are just so egregious that that may not seem like a really appropriate way to handle that, and that we might move straight to an administrative proceeding. So assuming that we felt that there were grounds for the discrimination, and assuming either that we wanted to move straight to an administrative proceeding, or we were unsuccessful in kind of a informal mediation, then what we would do is file a complaint on the county's behalf. And I think that is really important to understand. At the end of the day, our office is still only representing the government. We do not represent the complainants themselves in the same way that, for instance, I handle all the animal ordinance violations. I don't represent someone who's been bitten by a dog, although I'll prosecute that case. So we would then file an action in an administrative action before the administrative hearing officer. And that can be a little confusing because our administrative hearing officer is our municipal court judge. But even though it will happen in the same courtroom and it will be in front of Judge Hope, it is technically a separate action before the administrative hearing officer. Once he receives notice of that, then he would have a duty to review the complaint and any answer that the alleged violator may choose to file. And an answer is just a written document basically saying what their response to whatever complaint is we filed. And then the judge is going to have to, the administrative hearing officer is going to have to make two determinations. He's going to have to determine whether the complaint is in conformity with the requirements of the ordinance. And then secondly, and most importantly, he's going to have to decide whether the proceeding is preempted by federal or state law. And that is a much more complicated conversation that we probably want to have today. But it is certainly possible that the administrative hearing officer could say, I think that the facts in this particular case indicate that it is preempted, and therefore he would dismiss the complaint. But we will not know until the judge actually sees the complaint whether that will happen. And I just really want to emphasize that all of this is very fact intensive, and every case will be handled individually on a case-by-case basis. And just because one case might be preempted does not mean that another case might be preempted, or just because one case we determined there wasn't sufficient evidence of discrimination does not mean that another case might have a different outcome. So following that review by the administrative hearing officer, he will either dismiss the complaint or he will proceed with the hearing scheduled on the complaint. And of course, we are oversimplifying this. There's certainly the possibility that the alleged violator might file some sort of legal action in the same way that we experienced with our downtown dress code violation, and we may end up in federal court for a year. So that is entirely possible. But the good news for any people who might seek to file a complaint watching this is that will not be your responsibility. Our office will be handling that. We will communicate with you. I'm happy to answer your questions to the best that we can. Again, making clear that we represent the government, and you certainly are entitled to have your own attorney if you'd like. That is not something that the county is able to pay for. So you would have to seek your own independent counsel if you so choose. And then obviously if you have a hearing on the merits, the administrative hearing officer will make a decision as to whether the violator did in fact violate a person's rights by committing this unlawful discrimination. And then once that is done, whoever is the losing party in this has a right to appeal to Superior Court if they choose to do so. So that is an option that's still out there. There's also some possibility for a more formal mediation process to kind of take place almost any time within this process, other than obviously the final determination by the administrative hearing officer. And then the penalty that I think is important to recognize is that the maximum possible civil penalty that we can provide is a $1,000 fine for the alleged violator. We are not able to provide any of that money to a complainant. So I just want to be clear about that. It's not $1,000 that goes to the complainant. It's a civil penalty that is paid to the unified government. But in the event that a violator has been penalized 3 times under this ordinance, they would then lose their opportunity to operate a business in Athens-Clarke County. And so that is a very significant punishment, and it's really the only significant one that we're able to provide by this ordinance.
Okay, thank you. I know it's a complicated thing, but thanks for kind of laying it out there from beginning to end. And Christine asked a question on, can you elaborate on what you mean by preempted, and which if the case was preempted, do you mean covered by state or federal? Or?
Yes, absolutely. So the issue is that there is a state law, and I cannot quote the citation off the top of my head, but what it says is that local governments don't have the right to interfere with private individuals' right to contract. And you might think that sounds actually pretty limited, but I think the argument is that it's not, because if you think about employment, if you think about housing, if you even think about public accommodations, like renting a hotel room, it's all based on agreements and contracts, at least at some level. And so there is a chance that the the administrative hearing officer, upon reviewing this, would say that if someone is alleging discrimination that is totally unrelated to a government actor, and by which I mean it's not that the government as an employer is violating your rights, it's not that the government is telling you can't get a permit that you've applied for because some sort of discriminatory reason, or even that it's not a vendor that has a contract with the government that is violating your rights, because then at least there's a connection. If it's totally, you're saying that your totally private business, your private employer is discriminating against you, it's possible that the administrative hearing officer will say that this ordinance is preempted by that state law that I mentioned, and that he can't move forward. That will just have to be an independent determination that the administrative hearing officer makes on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, all right. I think that helps understand that. So Nikki and Crystal, I'll bring you in on this now that we've kind of got through the cogs and machinery of how the ordinance works. I know right now we have a discussion going on in LRC, in the Legislative Review Committee, about the Human Rights Committee, or whatever that's going to be called. So I know some of this might be getting discussed there. But I was wondering if there's any steps being taken to help individuals know about the non-discrimination ordinance and how to take advantage of it, and if we've been thinking about any outreach efforts, or just any kind of efforts to help people understand how to do it and how to take advantage of it.
Thank you, Commissioner Denson, and again, appreciate you having us here tonight to kind of discuss the NDO, very important topic. As you alluded, the LRC is looking into a Human Relations Commission, and that Human Relations Commission, theoretically right now, because it has been voted on, but we're just talking through it. But what we've heard is that the Human Relations Commission would be a major vehicle in engagement, education related to those pathways of complaints for the NDO. So, how do people actually know where to go? Sherry did a great job talking about where to go, how the process works, but do people actually know? And that's been part of the conversation, that the HRC would play a pretty big role in educating the public about that, having that dialogue in the community and, explaining what those pathways are.
Fantastic. I appreciate that, Manager Jones. And Legislative Review Committee is meeting very diligently to work through that, and hopefully we'll have something before the commission here soon that we can be able to vote on and discuss. And I'll go ahead and get to Christine asked another question in the chat, and this is probably going to go back to you, Sherry. And it's a good question. What if it's a case of ongoing discrimination? How does that factor into the 3 strikes and you lose your business license? Like, could a person bring, say, proof of 3 different incidents of discrimination, or does it have to be very separate incidents?
That is a fantastic question. So the general rule with ordinance violations, and this applies to any ordinance violation, whether that's the dress code, whether that's non-discrimination, whether that's regular code enforcement or animal services, is that we can issue citations basically every single day that a violation continues. And so the perfect example of this, although we really choose not to do this if we can, is that we have code enforcement has to deal with accumulation of refuse, for instance. So you imagine maybe someone is hoarding and they have just large piles of debris on their property. It often is really difficult to clean that up in a quick time frame. So in theory, code enforcement could go out and cite someone every single day that they fail to clean it up. We don't typically do that. So what I would say, though, is that this is a very different circumstance. And I think discrimination is an active act, right? You are actively choosing to discriminate against someone on a daily basis. It's not something that is really just inertia. So I would say that certainly if you felt that you had been discriminated against on multiple occasions, that you could fill out a separate complaint for each one of those acts. I think it's cleaner to fill out a separate complaint, although I suppose you could certainly allege multiple ones in different complaints, or sorry, in the same complaint. But I would certainly think of them as separate cases, and we certainly could bring multiple cases.
That's a great question. Yeah, thank you. And Crystal, I had a question for you because right now we're talking about this very important ordinance, and it kind of speaks to what we do not want to have in our community and how we're going about trying to get rid of the things that we do not want to have, like discrimination. But I know in your office, in the Office of Inclusion, a lot of the work is focused on trying to get what we want in our community, how to get more diversity, more equity, more inclusion happening in our community and in our local government. So I wanted to make this a little bit of space where you could speak to some of the positive developments that are going to make our community better in those kind of ways to find more diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's a really good question, Commissioner Denson, but it's also an incredibly broad question.
It is.
So I will do my best to provide a response. And again, thank you for having me here today as well. So the first thought that comes to mind is, I think the conversation you've convened here today with respect to the Unlawful Discrimination Ordinance, otherwise known as the Non-Discrimination Ordinance in the NDO, and also what was discussed with respect to the HRC are 2 really positive examples of what this work can look like within our community. So especially if you think about the Human Relations Commission, the Human Relations Commission will involve the creation of an ordinance, and it will also involve the creation of recommendations that accompany that ordinance. And one of the things to keep in mind, if you go back to the very first meeting that we had with the Legislative Review Committee, is that a Human Relations Commission has the ability to move forward culture change throughout our community, in addition to upholding an ordinance that's passed. And in thinking through some of the discussions that our elected officials and the Legislative Review Committee have had, that is one of the emerging priorities that's been shared, is creating a forum for ongoing community discussion across differences. I'm creating a vehicle for community education and outreach. I'm serving as a bridge that connects our local government to our community at a grassroots level, and also as a vehicle for bringing information and context and lived experiences back to our elected body and to the Inclusion Office. I share this in response to your question because culture change isn't something that happens in isolation. And it typically isn't something that's a result of a one-time event. And so the piece about education becomes really critical, because as a community, if we aren't aware of the resources that are available to us, it becomes really, really difficult to engage. But as you as elected officials have emphasized again and again, it's also important that we're talking with each other consistently across our differences and across our lived experiences. And so as a community, making it a priority to stay connected, to share our lived experiences with each other, to talk about where we agree, and even more importantly, to talk about where we disagree is really, really critical. And the creation of a Human Relations Commission is one vehicle that can help to facilitate that. So I'm happy to stop there, but I can also share more if you'd like me to. Just let me know.
Okay, well, how about this? I'll get to the one other question that popped up here, and then yeah, actually, I would love to build this delve a little more, because I think that's an important part of the conversation to be having with what we're talking about, the non-discrimination ordinance. I feel like it needs to be talked about in a more holistic way. But I will jump into this. I think this is another legal question. So Sherry, I'll throw this to you. But it's another good one. Does this non-discrimination ordinance cover undocumented residents here in Athens-Clarke County, or I guess any undocumented resident who might come into Athens and experience discrimination?
That's a great question. So one of the only references that we left to the word citizen in this ordinance is when we talk about the 14th Amendment. And that's because the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, and I believe both also the Georgia Constitution, specifically speaks to citizens, protections for citizens, not merely persons, which a lot of other US constitutional amendments only refer to persons. And so I think that the short answer to that is that it's really unclear at this point that we can apply this ordinance to people who are not citizens, because it's unclear that those particular statutes or those particular constitutional provisions that we're relying on apply to citizens as well. What I will say though is that I think that one, nowhere in our application do we ask if someone is documented or not. And I have no intention of us seeking that information, nor do I see it coming up unless an alleged violator makes an issue of it. Second point, excuse me, is that I think this is an area of the law that is developing. And so I would say that to someone who's watching this who maybe is underdocumented and is interested in filing a complaint, I would encourage you to do so and let us explore that. Obviously, I understand why you may not wish to, but certainly our office, is not going to request any identification documents beyond your signature. So if that gives you any comfort, certainly would encourage you to go ahead and submit that application or that complaint. I think the other thing to say is, while we can't give you legal advice in our office, if you have questions about this ordinance or what would happen if you submit a complaint, you're always welcome to reach out to me and talk to me. My number is 706-613-3035. So feel free to always give us a call or stop by and talk to us.
Another good question and good answer. Thank you for that. And yeah, as we just have a few minutes left, and unless other questions come through, Crystal, I will ask just to dig in a little bit more there, because I think it is very important. Like you brought up that culture change. And I guess the way I've personally been thinking about it is that the NDO, again, very important policy that we need in place, that I think you even said brings up around a specific instance that might have happened. And it's a very sharp tool that's a very precise tool. But for us to really grapple with these larger issues across our entire community, for us to experience, like you said, that culture change, that's going to take a lot more long-term digging in, bringing in tons of parties, making our table as big as possible and a seat for everyone to kind of get into. And I know that y'all in the Office of Inclusion have been doing some interesting work there with the book club and with the podcast and stuff like that. So if there's any of those other things that you want to speak to about how we're working on that culture change.
So I will do my best to remember as much as I can, but if I forget something, please forgive me. So here are some of the things that come to mind. There's a podcast. It's called the Ath History Podcast, and it features the stories of Athens as told by the people of Athens. And one of the reasons that we began to create that vehicle is so that it could serve as a tool for us to begin to learn about the life experiences that we haven't navigated ourselves, and also so that we could learn more deeply about our historical context within Athens-Clarke County, which is a critical foundational piece of engaging in conversations across differences. We've begun a series of community conversations. The primary way that we've been able to take action on that thus far is via an anti-racism social justice coalition that's being hosted by the Athens Regional Library System called One Book Athens, that involves a reading of Stamped. And we have so far hosted 2 virtual community conversations on racial equity that center the experiences of local residents. So during the first conversation, Lemuel Life LaRoche was the opening introductory speaker. And then residents went into breakout rooms to answer 3 questions about racial equity and engage in meaningful dialogue. In the second conversation, Ms. Hattie Thomas Whitehead, along with Life in the first conversation, was kind enough to be willing to come and share her story and her experience and the importance of coordination and mobilization in order to create societal change. That brings us very organically to the Athens Justice and Memory Project, which is the first resident-led committee of its kind that was assembled by Mayor Gertz, I believe, last year. Forgive me if my timeline is off. But the Athens Justice and Memory Project is specifically working to atone for the impact of urban renewal policies on African-American communities here in Athens-Clarke County. And the first such community that the Athens Justice and Memory Project is focused on is in Lenintown. To my understanding, it is known that there are 2 additional areas within Athens that were affected in this way. They are Lickskillet and the Bottoms. And it is also my understanding that members of the Athens Justice and Memory Project are in the process of reaching out to members from those communities as well to begin that work. We are working on a project called We Are Athens Together, where one of the challenges we've heard from our residents is a sense of feeling disconnected from local government. We know that there are massive trust gaps throughout our community. So one of the things we're hoping to do is to find a coordinated way to bring local resources from the government to our community, rather than asking our community to come to us. That's a program that we're working on and getting up off the ground as we speak. There's the Human Relations Commission that is taking shape as well. I'm forgetting a lot of things in this moment, so you'll have to forgive me. I think by way of just general information, the Inclusion Office engages in a lot of education, a lot of advising. A lot of our work is a bit behind the scenes, but yet deeply meaningful. An example of that is we are responsible for supporting 41 internal departments throughout ACC Gov. We did recently an equity training for our elected officials to support our elected officials in implementing and utilizing an equity lens in day-to-day decision-making. If you'd like to get some additional context, you can always visit our website at acc.gov/inclusion. And we're always here to listen and answer any questions that you might have.
Fantastic. I think that was pretty comprehensive there, Crystal, so I appreciate that. With I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we'll probably go ahead and end this a little bit early tonight, but I think it's been very, very helpful. Sherry, Nikki, Crystal, does anybody have any final comments or anything else they wanted to address? No?
Commissioner Denson, I do have one quick thought.
Okay, please.
Simply because you asked about culture change, I would just encourage us as a locality to listen to each other across differences, because listening is not a passive activity. Listening is one of the critical steps that helps us gather data, helps us deepen our understanding, and that helps to move us towards taking coordinated action. And coordinated action is incredibly critical if we want to be sure that we are expanding the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion across our community. So that was one very last thought that came to mind. The very, very last thing is we as a local government are about to embark upon conducting a disparity study. So if you are out there and you are listening to this training, if you receive a call or a request to participate and community conversations about disparity as it applies to owning a business, please engage and participate and be sure that your voice is heard as we are going through this process. It's a really critical step that we're moving towards. And it's just an important note, I think, for everyone to know about.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the disparity study. That's an important part of this conversation too. And just for everybody to understand, we're just digging in to try to find any disparities, specifically racial disparities, but also along other protected traits with the purchasing that Athens-Clarke County might be doing, with contracts and contractors. And so, yes, please engage with that process as we roll that out. It is very, very important. We need to have an accurate and true representation of that history. So thank you very much for bringing that up, Crystal. Sherry, did you have one last comment? Or okay, please.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that I think that the question about, which was an excellent question about underdocumented individuals, is just really nuanced. And so I would just really encourage anybody who's listening that regardless of your status, if you have concerns, please call me, send me an email. Let's chat about it before you file a complaint. Let us try to brainstorm that. I don't want people to leave from this thinking that there's definitely no way that we could do something. I just want to be cautious about that because I think it's just not as clear as it might otherwise be.
Thank you, Sherry. And yeah, from what I've been taking from your comments around that and also around some of the other things is that if you feel like you've been discriminated against and you're not sure if this ordinance applies to you, please go ahead and contact the attorney's office so that it can be explored if it does apply. Don't assume that it doesn't. Let's first assume that it does and go from there. So that's a great point for us to kind of be ending on there. I want to thank all three of y'all. I hope that us going through this like really complex ordinance, but also how it ties into the coming up Human Relations Commission and the disparity study, that this really kind of highlights the amazing work that I think that is being done by Sherry in our attorney's office and by Nikki in our manager's office and by Crystal in the inclusion office and along with all the rest of our staff. This stuff is amazingly complicated and it has to be built oftentimes from the ground up. And I'm constantly impressed that the vision that the community puts out there and that I'm honored to be a representative to bring that vision, that we have a staff that can actually build that vision and enact it. So much thanks to y'all for being here with this and for all the work that you did on it and for helping explain it. And I just hope everyone has a great evening. And everybody, please, if there's questions, we have resources for you to go out to and reach out to. So please do. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.